The elevator lurched to a grinding halt between floors 23 and 24. And Harper Williams knew immediately that her worst nightmare was about to unfold. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging the small metal box into absolute darkness. "Perfect," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hammering of her heart. Absolutely perfect. She wasn't alone. Through the suffocating blackness, she could hear the steady breathing of her unwanted companion, Blake Sterling. The man she'd spent 3 years carefully avoiding in hallways, ducking into supply closets when she saw him coming, and pretending not to notice when he glanced her way during company meetings. Blake Sterling, CEO of Sterling Corporation. Ice King himself. The man who fired department heads over coffee temperature and had never been seen smiling. Ever. "Your breathing is getting erratic," his voice cut through the darkness, clinical and detached. "Panic won't help us." Hands found the button panel, desperately pressing every surface she could touch. Emergency. Alarm. Door open. Nothing responded. The buttons felt cold and lifeless under her trembling fingers. "Stop that," Blake said, his tone sharp. "You'll drain what little power we have left." "Sorry for trying to get us out of this metal coffin," Harper shot back, continuing her frantic button assault. "Some of us don't want to die in an elevator with their worst enemy." Strange sound emerged from his side of the elevator. Almost like laughter, but that was impossible. Blake Sterling didn't laugh. It was scientifically proven. "Did you just laugh at me?" she demanded, incredulous. "No, you did. I heard it. You're oxygen deprived, hallucinating, faint blue." Glow suddenly illuminated the small space as Blake activated his phone's flashlight. The light carved harsh shadows across his angular face, making him look less like the corporate automaton she knew and more like something dangerous, something almost human. Harper pressed herself against the far wall, her red hair catching the phone's glow like fire. She was still wearing the ridiculously tight black dress her supervisor had forced her into. For the Japanese investor meeting, the dress had no pockets, no place to hide, no escape route.
"I'll no escape,"
Blake announced, holding his phone toward the ceiling. "Of course not," Harper muttered. "This day just keeps getting better." She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her head in her hands. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air growing thinner with each breath. She could feel the familiar panic rising in her chest, the same terror that had haunted her since childhood. "Claustrophobia?" Blake asked, and there was something different in his voice, something that almost sounded like concern. Harper looked up at him through the dim light. He was still standing, perfectly composed, like being trapped in a broken elevator was just another Tuesday for him. "How did you know that?" she whispered. Blake lowered his phone slightly, the light casting strange patterns on the elevator walls. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then quietly he said, "Harper Williams, 27 years old, marketing department. 3 years, allergic to shellfish, takes the stairs whenever possible, except when she thinks no one is watching." Harper's blood turned to ice. "You've been watching me? Watch all my employees. You have over 1,000 employees." "I know." The silence that followed was deafening. Harper stared at him, trying to process what he'd just admitted. Sterling, the man who supposedly cared about nothing but profit margins and quarterly reports, had been observing her daily routines, noticing her quirks, remembering details about her life that she'd never shared with anyone at work. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Blake turned away, the phone light creating a halo around his dark hair. "That's not important right now." But Harper could see something in his posture, a tension that hadn't been there before. For the first time since she'd known him, Blake Sterling looked almost vulnerable. The elevator groaned around them, a metallic sound that made Harper's skin crawl. The air was definitely getting thinner. Her heart was racing, her palms sweating, and the walls seemed to be closing in with each passing second. "I need to get out," she gasped, scrambling to her feet. "I need to get out right now." She lunged for the buttons again, pressing everything she could reach, pulling at the doors with her bare hands. The metal was cold and unyielding like a tomb. "Harper." Blake's voice was calm, steady. "Look at me." She spun around, wild-eyed and breathing hard. In the phone's glow, she could see that he'd moved closer.
Much closer.
Close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made her head spin.
"Tell me why you're really afraid," he said softly.
"It's not just claustrophobia." Harper's chest was rising and falling rapidly. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like he could see straight through her carefully constructed professional facade. "When I was 8, she whispered. "I was visiting my grandmother in the hospital. The elevator cables snapped. We fell to floors. Before the emergency brakes caught us." Blake's expression changed. The cold, calculating mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something raw and genuine underneath. "Were you hurt?" The concern in his voice caught her completely off guard. This wasn't the Blake Sterling she knew. This was someone else entirely, someone who cared about her pain, someone who saw her as more than just another employee. "Broke my wrist," she said, unconsciously rubbing the old injury. "But the fear never went away. Every time I step into an elevator, I remember that feeling of falling, of being completely helpless." "Then why do you use elevators at work?" Blake asked. "I've seen you. Every morning, you take the elevator to the 15th floor. Harper stared at him. Really had been watching her, paying attention to details that no one else would notice. "Because sometimes," she said slowly, "the only way to overcome fear is to face it, even if your hands shake. Even if you count every second until the doors open." Blake was quiet for a long moment. Then, so softly she almost didn't hear it, he said, "That's brave, or stupid. Definitely brave." Something had shifted between them in the darkness. The air felt charged, electric, like the moment before a thunderstorm. Harper found herself studying his face in the phone's glow, seeing details she'd never noticed before. The way his jaw tightened when he was thinking, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the fact that his eyes weren't the cold gray she'd always thought, but a deep blue, like the ocean before a storm. "Blake," she whispered, not sure what she was going to say next. But before she could finish the thought, the lights flickered back on, harsh and bright after the intimate darkness. The elevator shuddered, then began moving upward with a mechanical whir. They stood there blinking in the sudden illumination, the spell broken. Blake had stepped back, his professional mask sliding back into place like armor. But Harper had seen what lay beneath it, and she knew she'd never be able to unsee it. When the doors opened on the 24th floor, Harper stepped out quickly, her legs unsteady. She turned back to see Blake still standing in the elevator, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "Harper," he said, his voice careful and controlled. "Would you have dinner with me tomorrow night?" The question hit her like physical blow. She gripped the doorframe, sure she'd misheard. "What? Dinner? Tomorrow? If you're willing?" Harper stared at him, looking for signs that this was some kind of elaborate test or corporate mind game. But all she saw was a man who looked genuinely nervous, for the first time since she'd known him. "Why?" she managed to ask. Blake's lips curved into the smallest hint of a smile, and Harper felt her heart skip a beat. "Because in the last 30 minutes I remembered what it feels like to be human," he said simply. "And I'd like to explore that feeling further." The elevator doors began to close, but Blake held them open with one hand. "Choose the restaurant," Harper heard herself say. "Somewhere normal. I want to see how you handle the real world." His smile widened, transforming his entire face. "Fair enough." The doors closed, leaving Harper alone in the hallway, staring at her reflection in the polished elevator doors. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged, and her hands were still, shaking slightly. But for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't afraid of Blake Sterling. She was terrified of what she might be feeling for him. Blake Sterling stood outside Mel's 24-hour diner at 7 o'clock sharp, wearing jeans that felt foreign against his skin and a simple button-down shirt that cost less than his usual tie. Through the grease-stained window, he could see Harper, already seated in a corner booth, her red hair catching the harsh fluorescent light as she studied what appeared to be the world's stickiest menu. She'd changed from her work clothes into dark jeans and a soft green sweater that made her eyes look like emeralds. Real, authentic, approachable. Everything he wasn't. "You can do this," he muttered under his breath. "It's just dinner. People do this all the time." The problem was, Blake Sterling didn't do dinner. Predictable scripts. He definitely didn't do diners where the coffee came in chipped mugs and the waitress wore rhinestone glasses. The little bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Harper looked up immediately. Her reaction was instantaneous. She burst into laughter, covering her mouth with her hand, but unable to hide the sparkle of amusement in her eyes. "Oh my God," she gasped. "You'd look like you're about to face a firing squad." Blake slid into the booth across from her, the vinyl squeaking under his weight. The sound was foreign, almost jarring compared to the whisper-quiet leather of his usual restaurants. "That would probably be easier," he admitted. "Relaxed," Harper said, sliding a menu. Across the table, "It's just food. Burgers, fries, pie. You know, normal human sustenance." Blake picked up the menu and stared at it like it was written in an ancient language. Everything had names like the Belly Buster and cardiac arrest on a plate. Where were the ingredient lists? The nutritional information? The wine pairings? "What do you recommend?" he asked, genuinely lost. "Well, what do you usually eat? Kale salads? Grilled salmon? Quinoa?" Harper stared at him for a long moment. "Seriously? Is that bad?" "Not bad." She gestured around the diner, taking in the cracked vinyl booths. "And the photos of local high school football teams taped to the walls? We might need to ease you into this."
"Oh.
"How do you feel about grilled cheese?" Before Blake could answer, a waitress with beehive hair and rhinestone Katai glasses appeared at their table like an apparition from the 1960s. Well, she said, looking Blake up and down with obvious appreciation. "Aren't you a tall drink? Of water?" "I'm Dolores, and I've been working here since the Carter administration." "What can I get you kids?" Harper grinned. "2 grilled cheese sandwiches, 2 chocolate milkshakes, and a basket of fries to share." "Coming right up," Sugar Dolores said, winking at Blake. "And honey, relax those shoulders. You look like you're posing for a statue." After she left, Blake did try to relax his shoulders, which only made Harper laugh harder. "Stop trying so hard," she said. "This isn't a board meeting." "Then what is it?" The question came out more vulnerable than he'd intended, and Harper's expression immediately softened. "It's 2 people getting to know each other," she said simply. "No agenda, no quarterly reports, no PowerPoints, just conversation." Blake nodded thoughtfully, then sat in silence for exactly 30 seconds before blurting out, "How has your work productivity been this quarter?" Harper nearly choked on her water. "Did you just ask me about productivity on a date?" "This is harder than it looks," Blake admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know how to talk to people without talking about work." "Okay, new rule," Harper said, leaning forward. "No work talk at all. We're going to have a normal conversation." "What's a normal conversation?" Harper studied his face, and Blake felt like she was seeing straight through him. It should have been uncomfortable, but somehow it wasn't. "Tell me something you loved as a kid," she said. "Before you had to be CEO Blake Sterling," Blake thought, for a moment surprised by how difficult the question was. When was the last time anyone had asked him about his childhood? When was the last time he'd even thought about it? "I used to build things," he said slowly. "Lego castles, model airplanes, tree houses in our backyard. My father said it was a waste of time, but he paused, remembering the satisfaction of creating something from nothing. I loved it, see?" "That wasn't so hard," Harper smiled. "What happened to that little boy who built castles? He grew up. Maybe he just got buried under quarterly projections and hostile takeover bids." Dolores returned with their order, setting down plates of golden grilled cheese sandwiches and thick chocolate milkshakes topped with whipped cream. Blake stared at his food like it might bite him. "It's not going to hurt you," Harper said, taking a huge bite of her sandwich. "Try it." Blake picked up the sandwich carefully, as if it were a delicate archaeological artifact. The bread was perfectly golden, the cheese oozing out the sides. He took a small, tentative bite, his eyes widened. In surprise, it was simple, unpretentious, and absolutely delicious. "Good," Harper asked, grinning at his expression. It's incredible, Blake said, taking another, larger bite. How is something so simple so perfect? Because it doesn't try to be anything other than what it is? Harper said meaningfully. Sometimes the best things are the most honest ones. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, and Blake found himself relaxing in spite of himself. The diner was warm and lived in. It was filled with the comfortable chatter of regular customers and the sizzle of food on the griddle. It felt real in a way that his usual world didn't. Can I ask you something? Harper said eventually. Blake nodded, surprised by how much he wanted to hear whatever she was going to say. Yesterday in the elevator, you said you watch all your employees. But you knew things about me that you couldn't have learned from watching. You knew I was allergic to shellfish. You knew about my grandmother. How? Blake set down his sandwich, his appetite suddenly gone. This was the moment he'd been dreading, the conversation he'd been avoiding for 3 years. Read your employee file, he said quietly. Everyone's employee file has their allergies listed. But my grandmother isn't in any company records. Blake was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. You mentioned her once. 3 years ago. You were talking to Sarah from accounting about taking time off for a hospital visit. I overheard. Harper stared at him. You remembered that? From 3 years ago? I remember everything about you, Blake said, then immediately regretted the admission. It sounded stalkerish, obsessive. It sounded like exactly what it was. But Harper didn't look frightened or disgusted. She looked curious. Why? She asked softly. Blake felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff about to jump into waters he couldn't see the bottom of. Everything in his training, his experience, his carefully constructed life told him to deflect, to change the subject, to retreat behind his professional armor. Instead, he told her the truth. Because you were the only person in that building who looked happy, he said. Everyone else walked around like they were serving a life sentence. But you laughed with the security guards. You brought birthday cakes for people in your department. You made the mailroom guy's day just by remembering his name. Harper was very still, listening. I realized, Blake continued, that I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen genuine happiness, real joy. I started paying attention to you because you reminded me that those things still existed. So you stalked me, Harper said, but there was no accusation in her voice. Just curiosity. I observed you, Blake corrected. I learned your routines because they became the only bright spots in my day. Seeing you take the elevator every morning, even though you were terrified. Watching you refuse to let fear control your life. It was the bravest thing I'd ever seen. Harper reached across the table and touched his hand. Her fingers were warm and soft, and Blake felt something electric shoot up his arm. Blake, she said gently, why do you always act like you're made of ice? The question hit him like a physical blow. He'd never had anyone ask him that so directly, so honestly. Most people were too intimidated to question his demeanor, too afraid of his reputation to dig deeper. Do you really want to know? He asked. We have time. Blake looked around the diner at the normal people living their normal lives, and felt like he was about to confess to a crime. My father built Sterling Corporation from nothing, he began. When I was a kid, he used to take me to the office every Saturday. He'd walk me through the floors, show me the operations, and tell me that someday all of this would be mine. But he'd also tell me that I'd have to be 10 times better than anyone else to deserve it. Harper squeezed his hand, encouraging him to continue. He died when I was 22, heart attack in his office, working late as always. Shareholders didn't think I could handle the company. Too young, too inexperienced, too soft. So I had to become something else, something harder. It worked, Harper said softly. It worked. But now Blake stopped, the words catching in his throat. Now what? Now. I don't know how to be anything else. I've been Blake Sterling, CEO, for so long that I'm not sure there's anything left of just Blake. Harper was quiet for a moment, processing what he'd told her. Then she said something that completely blindsided him. You smiled at me once. Blake looked at her, confused. When? 6 months ago, at the company Christmas party. I was trying to reach a champagne glass on the high table and almost knocked over all the decorations. When I looked around to see if anyone had noticed, you were watching me, and you smiled. A real smile, not the corporate one you use in meetings. Blake remembered. He remembered the way her dress had sparkled under the party lights, the way she'd laughed at her own clumsiness, the way she'd looked so genuinely joyful in that moment. "Remember," he said quietly. "Why did you smile?" Blake felt that cliff edge again, that moment of truth that could change everything. "Because you looked free," he said. "It's like you didn't care what anyone thought. I wanted to know what that felt like." The air between them had changed, charged with something electric and dangerous. Harper's eyes were wide, searching his face like she was seeing him for the first time. "Blake," she started to say, but was interrupted by Dolores appearing with the check. "How was everything, kids?" waitress asked, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. "Perfect," Harper said, not taking her eyes off Blake. "Absolutely perfect." As they left the diner, stepping out into the cool night air, Blake felt like he'd crossed some invisible line. He'd exposed parts of himself that he'd kept hidden for years, shown Harper pieces of his soul that he'd thought were dead and buried. And instead of running away, she'd stayed. She'd listened. She'd understood. "Thank you," he said as they reached her car. "For what? For reminding me who I used to be?" Harper smiled, the streetlights catching the copper highlights in her hair. "Blake, yeah? This is the best date I've ever been on?" She stood on her tiptoes and kissed his cheek, soft and quick and perfect. Then she got in her car and drove away, leaving Blake standing alone on the sidewalk, touching the spot where her lips had been, and wondering if it was possible to fall in love with someone in the space of 2 conversations. The answer, he was beginning to realize, was yes. Absolutely. Terrifyingly, wonderfully yes. Harper arrived at the office the next morning with a secret burning in her chest and absolutely no idea how to handle it. She'd barely slept, replaying every moment from dinner, every word Blake had shared, every vulnerable expression that had crossed his face in the diner's fluorescent light. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt different now. Instead of counting seconds and fighting panic, she found herself remembering the way Blake had looked at her in the darkness. The genuine concern in his voice when he'd asked if she'd been hurt. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. "You look different," Sarah from accounting said as Harper settled at her desk. "Glowing or something? Did you get a facial?" "Something like that," Harper murmured, turning on her computer and trying to focus on anything other than the fact that Blake Sterling was somewhere in this building. Probably thinking about their dinner. Probably wondering the same things she was wondering. Like whether last night had been real or some kind of beautiful dream. Like whether he'd meant everything he'd said. Like what happened next. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Thank you for last night. I haven't slept that well in years." Harper stared at the message, her heart doing something acrobatic in her chest. Blake Sterling had her personal number. Blake Sterling was texting her. Blake Sterling had admitted to sleeping well, which somehow seemed like the most intimate confession of all. She was still staring at her phone when her supervisor, Linda Morrison, appeared at her cubicle with the expression of someone who'd just won the corporate lottery. "Williams," Linda said, barely able to contain her excitement. "Mr. Sterling wants to see you in his office now." The blood drained from Harper's face. Around her, she could feel her coworkers' curious stares, hear the barely whispered speculations about what Harper Williams could have possibly done to warrant a personal summons from the CEO. "Did he say why?" Harper asked, her voice coming out smaller than she'd intended. "He didn't share his reasoning with me," Linda replied. But her eyes were gleaming with the kind of anticipation that comes from watching someone else walk toward their potential execution. "But I'd suggest you get up there immediately. Mr. Sterling doesn't like to be kept waiting." Harper's legs felt like jelly as she walked toward the executive elevator. The same elevator where everything had started less than 24 hours ago. But now, instead of dread, she felt something else entirely. Anticipation mixed with terror, hope tangled with fear. The ride to the 30th floor seemed both eternal and far too short. When the doors opened, she stepped into the executive suite's marble and glass reception area, where Blake's assistant, Margaret, sat behind a desk that probably cost more than Harper's annual salary. "Ms. Williams," Margaret said without looking up from her computer, "Mr. Sterling is waiting for you. Go right in." Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city. and everything else polished mahogany, leather furniture. Awards and accolades lined up with military precision spoke of power and achievement. Blake stood with his back to the door, looking out at the city skyline. He was wearing another perfectly tailored suit, his dark hair impeccable. Every inch the successful CEO, but Harper could see the tension in his shoulders. The way his hands were clasped behind his back like he was bracing himself for something. "Close the door," he said, without turning around. Harper did as instructed, soft click of the latch seeming unnaturally loud in the vast space. "You wanted to see me?" she said, hating how formal her own voice sounded. Blake turned around and Harper's breath caught in her throat. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept as well as his text had claimed. But more than that, he looked conflicted, like he was fighting some internal battle that she couldn't see. "I made a mistake," he said. Abruptly, Harper felt her heart plummet last night. "No." Blake ran a hand through his hair, destroying its perfect styling. "I don't know." He walked to his desk and picked up a manila folder, holding it like it contained something toxic. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. Harper shook her head, though. She had a sinking feeling she could guess. "Oh, it's your employee file. Your real employee file, not the basic one that HR keeps." Blake opened the folder, and Harper could see pages of information, far more than should exist about any single employee. Your performance reviews, your salary history, your health insurance claims, your emergency contacts, your college transcripts, your previous employment records. Harper stared at him, feeling cold. "Blake, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I know you graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern with a degree in marketing and a minor in psychology. I know that you turned down job offers from 3 bigger companies to work here. I know that you send money to your parents every month, and that you volunteer at the animal shelter on weekends, and that you once called in sick because your neighbor's cat had surgery and you were the only one who could take care of it." Each fact hit Harper like a physical blow. This wasn't casual observation or overheard conversations. This was systematic information gathering. This was surveillance. "I know," Blake continued, his voice getting quieter, "that you broke up with your college boyfriend because he wanted you to move to California with him, but you couldn't leave your grandmother. I know that you've never been in a serious relationship since then because you don't trust easily. I know that you're afraid of elevators because of a childhood trauma, but you take them anyway because you refuse to let fear control your life." Harper felt like the floor was disappearing beneath her feet. "How do you know all of this?" Blake set the file down on his desk with hands that weren't quite steady. "Because I've been having you investigated for 3 years. The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Harper stared at him, trying to process what he'd just admitted. "Investigated," she repeated flatly. "I told myself it was for security reasons, that I needed to know about my employees, especially ones who caught my attention. But that wasn't true." Blake's voice was barely above a whisper. "The truth is, I was obsessed with you. I wanted to know everything about you because I couldn't stop thinking about you." Harper felt sick. The beautiful, vulnerable man from last night was disappearing, replaced by something darker, more complex.
Hey.
Something that scared her. "So everything you said at dinner," she said slowly, "about remembering things I'd said, about noticing my routines, that was all based on information you'd gathered illegally?" "Not illegally," Blake said quickly. "Everything in this file came from legitimate sources. Background check companies, public records, social media. That's not the point." Harper exploded, her voice echoing off the office's high ceilings. "Point is that you violated my privacy. You had me stalked." "I know," Blake said, and there was genuine anguish in his voice. "I know it was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I did it, but I couldn't stop myself." Harper hugged her arms around herself, feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with the elevator's darkness. "Why are you telling me this now?" Blake was quiet for a long moment, staring at the file on his desk, like it contained his own death sentence. "Because after last night, I realized that everything I thought I knew about you was based on information I had no right to possess. And if we're going to have any kind of relationship, it needs to be built on honesty, not surveillance." "Any kind of relationship?" Harper's voice was sharp. You think there's still going to be a relationship after this? Blake looked at her with something that might have been hope and might have been desperation. I was hoping you'd understand. Understand what? That my boss has been spying on me for 3 years? That the man I had dinner with last night is actually a creepy stalker with unlimited resources? I'm not a stalker, Blake said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Then what are you? Harper demanded. 'Cause the Blake from last night, the one who told me about his father and his fears, that person I could care about. But this person, the one who hires private investigators to learn about his employees' personal lives, this person terrifies me. Blake flinched like she'd slapped him. They're the same person, Harper. I'm both of those people. No, Harper said, backing toward the door. The Blake from last night was honest and vulnerable. This Blake is manipulative and controlling, and I can't tell which one is real. They're both real, Blake said desperately. I did terrible things, but for the right reasons. I was falling in love with you, and I didn't know how to handle it. Harper stopped with her hand on the door handle. You don't fall in love with someone by spying on them, Blake. You fall in love by getting to know them honestly, openly, with their consent. Then let me do that, Blake said, stepping toward her. Let me start over. Let me get to know you the right way. Harper looked at him for a long moment, studying his face, trying to see past the expensive suit and corporate power to the man underneath. She could see the desperation there, the genuine remorse, but she could also see something else. Something that looked like entitlement, like the assumption that his confession would somehow make everything okay. No, she said quietly. Blake's face crumpled. Harper, please no, she repeated, more firmly this time. You don't get to violate someone's privacy for 3 years and then ask for a do-over because you feel guilty about it. She opened the door, then paused and looked back at him. You want to know something that's not in your file? She said, I was starting to fall in love with you too. The real you, or at least the you I thought was real. But now, I'll never know which parts of last night were genuine, and which parts were based on information you had no right to possess. Blake looked like she'd just torn his heart out of his chest. Harper, delete the file, Blake, she said. All of it. And don't ever do this to anyone else. She left him standing in his office, surrounded by all the trappings of his success, looking more alone than anyone had a right to look, as the elevator descended to the 15th floor. Harper felt the panic starting to set in again. Not the claustrophobia this time, but something worse. The fear that she'd just walked away from something that could have been beautiful, if only it hadn't been built on such rotten foundation. Her phone buzzed with another text. The file is gone. All of it. I'm sorry. B. Harper stared at the message, then deleted it without responding. But she didn't delete his number. And as much as she hated herself for it, she couldn't quite bring herself to stop caring about the man who'd shown her glimpses of his soul, even if he'd accessed hers through morally questionable means. The question was, what happened now? Could trust be rebuilt from scratch? Could love survive such a fundamental violation of privacy? Harper didn't know the answers. But as the elevator doors opened and she stepped back into her ordinary world, she knew that despite everything, she wanted to find out. Harper hadn't spoken to Blake Sterling in 3 weeks, but his presence haunted every corner of her life. He didn't text her again after that first apology, didn't call, didn't appear unexpectedly at her desk or in the hallway. It was as if he'd simply vanished from her world, leaving behind only the memory of 2 conversations that had turned her entire understanding of herself upside down. Which was why she was completely unprepared to find him sitting on the steps of her apartment building at 9 o'clock on a Friday night. Still wearing his work clothes, but looking more disheveled than she'd ever seen him. What are you doing here? She asked, clutching her grocery bags tighter. She'd been planning a quiet evening alone, maybe a bottle of wine and a rom-com that would make her cry for reasons that had nothing to do with her real life. Blake looked up at her and Harper's breath caught. His hair was messy, his tie loosened, and there were dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't been sleeping. But more than that, he looked broken in a way that made her chest ache, despite everything. I quit, he said simply. Harper stared at him. What? I resigned from Sterling. Corporation this afternoon, effective immediately. The grocery bag slipped from Harper's suddenly nerveless fingers, oranges rolling across the sidewalk. Blake, that's impossible. You can't just quit your own company. I can, and I did. Blake stood up, and Harper noticed he was holding a thick, manila envelope. I sold my shares to the board of directors. They're probably having a celebration right now. Harper felt like the world had tilted off its axis. Blake Sterling without Sterling Corporation was like the sun without the sky. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be real. Why? She whispered. Blake held out the envelope. Because you were right about everything. Harper took the envelope with shaking hands. Inside were dozens of documents, legal papers, financial statements, resignation letters. But on top was a single sheet of paper with her name written across it in Blake's precise handwriting. What is this? It's everything, Blake said. Every piece of information I ever gathered about you. Every report, every photograph, every detail. I printed it all out so you could see exactly what I did, exactly how far I violated your privacy. Harper's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. There were photos of her leaving her apartment, reports on her daily routines, detailed. Analyses of her social media posts, financial information, medical records, transcripts of conversations she'd had in public places. It was comprehensive, invasive, and absolutely horrifying. My gosh, she breathed. Blake, this is unforgivable, he finished. I know. I've known for 3 weeks, but seeing it all together like that, realizing the extent of what I'd done, it made me sick. Harper looked up at him, seeing the genuine self-loathing in his expression. So you quit your job? I quit everything? Company, the board positions, the charity committees, all of it. I can't be that person anymore, Harper. The person who thinks power gives him the right to invade other people's lives? I won't be him. What are you going to do? Blake shrugged, and the gesture was so unlike the controlled CEO, she knew that it was almost heartbreaking. I don't know. I've never not known what I was going to do. It's terrifying and exhilarating, and I have absolutely no idea how to handle it. Harper sat down on the steps, the envelope heavy in her lap. Blake, you can't make major life decisions because of something that happened between us. That's not healthy. I'm not doing it because of you, Blake said, sitting down beside her, but carefully maintaining distance. I'm doing it because of me, because I looked at those files and realized I'd become exactly the kind of person I'd always despised. Controlling, manipulative, convinced that the ends justified any means. He was quiet for a moment, staring at his hands. Do you know what the worst part was? He asked finally. Harper shook her head. The worst part was that it worked. All that information, all that surveillance, it did help me understand you better. It made our conversations deeper, more meaningful, because I already knew what buttons to push, what topics would resonate. And that made me feel like even more of a monster. Harper felt tears prick at her eyes, not for herself, but for him. For the man who'd been so desperate for connection that he'd convinced himself stalking was a form of intimacy. Blake, she said softly, why didn't you just ask me out? 3 years ago, when you first noticed me, why didn't you just walk up to my desk and invite me for coffee? Blake looked at her like she'd asked him why he didn't just fly to the moon. Because I didn't know how, he said simply. I've never asked anyone out, Harper. Every relationship I've ever had has been arranged through mutual friends or business connections or charity events. The idea of just walking up to someone and risking rejection, it was paralyzing. So instead, you had me investigated. I convinced myself that knowledge was the same as understanding. That if I knew enough about you, I could figure out the perfect approach, the perfect moment, the perfect words. Blake laughed bitterly. It never occurred to me that the perfect approach was just being honest. Harper stared at the envelope in her lap, at the physical manifestation of 3 years of obsession and violation. She should be angry. She should be calling the police, filing restraining orders, making sure Blake Sterling paid for what he'd done. Instead, she found herself thinking about the man in the elevator, the one who'd shared his deepest fears and childhood dreams. The man who'd looked at her like she was the most fascinating person in the world. Not because he'd read about her in a file, but because something in her touched something in him. "What do you want from me, Blake?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. And she could hear the truth in his voice. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness, or a second chance, or anything else. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I did was wrong, and that I'm trying to become someone who deserves the kind of genuine connection I destroyed between us." Harper looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something she'd never seen before. Blake Sterling without his armor, without his power, without his carefully constructed persona. Just a man who'd made terrible mistakes and was trying to figure out how to live with the consequences. "You know what the really messed up part is?" she said. Blake waited. "I've been miserable for 3 weeks. Not just angry or hurt, but genuinely miserable. Because despite everything you did, despite all the lies and manipulation and violation of privacy, I can't stop thinking about the person you were in that diner. The person who built Lego castles and remembered what it felt like to be human." Blake's breath caught. "Harper, I'm not saying I forgive you," she said quickly. "I'm not saying we can just pick up where we left off. What you did was inexcusable, and it's going to take a long time for me to trust you again if I ever can. I understand." "But," Harper continued, surprising herself with what she was about to say, "I think maybe the person you're trying to become might be worth getting to know. The real way this time? That. With honesty and consent and all those revolutionary concepts." Blake stared at her like she'd just offered him salvation. "You'd be willing to try?" "I'd be willing to start from scratch," Harper corrected. "Clean slate. No history, no files, no preconceptions. Just two people figuring out if they have anything real in common." "How would that work?" Harper thought for a moment, then smiled for the first time in 3 weeks. "Well, for starters, you could ask me out. The normal way." Blake's face lit up with something that might have been hope. He stood up, straightened his tie in a gesture that was purely nervous rather than professional, and looked down at her with an expression of absolute terror and determination. "Harper Williams," he said formally, "would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow night? I promise to know absolutely nothing about you except what you choose to tell me." Harper grinned. "I thought you'd never ask." She stood up to go. Into her building, Blake caught her hand gently. "Harper," he said, "thank you, for giving me the chance to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be my father." "Thank you," Harper replied, "for reminding me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is start over." She squeezed his hand once, then let go, and walked into her building, leaving Blake standing on the sidewalk with something he'd never had before: a real chance at authentic love, built on truth instead of surveillance, honesty instead of manipulation. It wouldn't be easy. Trust, once broken, was difficult to rebuild. But as Harper watched him from her window, walking away with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders straight, she thought maybe they both deserved the chance to find out what they could be when they stopped hiding from each other. Envelope, full of violations, sat on her kitchen counter, a reminder of how wrong things had gone. But tomorrow, she thought, they'd try to get them right. The elevator in Harper's new apartment building was nothing like the sleek corporate machine where everything had started. It was old and temperamental, with brass buttons that stuck and a tendency to shudder between floors. Not Harper no longer minded elevators. Not since the afternoon 6 months ago when Blake Sterling had appeared on her doorstep and offered her his entire dark history in a manila envelope. She was coming home from the small marketing firm where she now worked, arms full of groceries and dry cleaning, when she spotted a familiar figure crouched in the hallway outside her apartment door. Blake was wearing jeans and a paint-splattered t-shirt, his hair disheveled, completely absorbed in assembling what appeared to be a complex wooden structure. "Please tell me you're not building furniture in my hallway," Harper said, setting down her bags. Blake looked up with the smile that still made her heart skip beats even after months of careful, honest courtship. "It's not furniture, it's a castle." Harper moved closer and saw that he was indeed building an intricate wooden castle, complete with towers and battlements and tiny windows. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every detail carefully carved and fitted together. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Did you make this?" "I've been working on it for 3 months, Blake said, sitting back on his heels. "Remember when I told you about building Lego castles as a kid? I wanted to see if I could still do it, with real wood this time." Harper knelt beside him, running her fingers over the smooth wood. It was warm to the touch, obviously crafted. With love and patience and meticulous attention to detail. What's it for? Blake's cheeks flushed slightly. I was hoping it might serve as a proposal prop. Harper's heart stopped. What now? Blake reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it to reveal a simple, elegant ring with a stone that caught the hallway light like captured starfire. Harper Williams, he said, his voice steady despite the obvious nerves. I know we agreed to start from scratch. I know I have a lot to make up for, and I know I'm still figuring out who I am when I'm not hiding behind corporate armor. But I also know that you're the bravest, the most genuine person I've ever met, and that I want to spend the rest of my life earning the right to love you honestly. Harper stared at him, at this man who'd quit his empire to become someone worthy of her trust, who'd spent months patiently rebuilding what he'd nearly destroyed, who'd literally crafted a castle with his own hands just to ask her to marry him. Blake, she whispered. I'm not the same person who violated your privacy, he continued. I'm not the CEO who thought power meant the right to take whatever I wanted. I'm just a man who builds things now, furniture for people who can't afford it, playground equipment for underprivileged schools, castles for the woman he loves because he wants to give her something beautiful that came from his hands instead of his wallet. Harper felt tears spilling down her cheeks. In the months since Blake had resigned from Sterling Corporation, she'd watched him transform himself completely, moved into a modest apartment, learned carpentry from YouTube videos, started volunteering at homeless shelters and animal rescues. He'd become the person the scared little boy who built Lego castles had always wanted to be. The ring isn't expensive, Blake said, misinterpreting her tears. I don't have the kind of money I used to have. I'm basically starting over from scratch, and I don't know what the future holds. But Harper silenced him by grabbing his face in both hands and kissing him with everything she had. He tasted like sawdust and hope and the promise of forever. And when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Is that a yes? Blake asked, his voice rough with emotion. That's a hell yes, Harper laughed, wiping tears from her eyes. But I have one condition. Blake's face fell slightly. What? Next time you want to propose, maybe try inside the apartment instead of the hallway. Mrs. Chen from 4B has been watching us through her peephole for the last 10 minutes. Blake looked over his shoulder and caught sight of an elderly woman's eye quickly disappearing behind a door. Genuine and nothing like the careful corporate chuckle Harper remembered from his CEO days. Deal, he said, slipping the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been made specifically for her hand. Although I should warn you, I'm probably going to spend the rest of our lives doing grand gestures involving things I've built myself. I can live with that, Harper said, admiring the way the ring caught the light. As long as you promise me something else. Anything. Promise me you'll never stop being the person who builds castles. The person who volunteers at shelters and makes furniture for people who need it and gets sawdust in his hair. Promise me you'll never go back to being the man who thought power was more important than people. Blake's expression grew serious. I promise, he said solemnly. I never want to be that person again. He was empty, Harper. Successful, but completely empty. This person, the one who gets to love you, this is who I want to be for the rest of my life. Harper kissed him again, softer this time, full of promise and trust, and the kind of love that's built on truth instead of surveillance. So, she said, when they broke apart, what do we do with the castle? Blake grinned. I was thinking we could put it on our mantelpiece. Reminder of where we started and where we're going. Our mantelpiece? Harper raised an eyebrow. Pretty presumptuous, don't you think? Well, Blake said, starting to gather up his tools. I was hoping you might want to move in together. I know it's fast, and I know we're still rebuilding trust. But I found this amazing apartment with huge windows and room for a workshop. And I thought maybe Blake, Harper interrupted. Yeah, I'd love to move in with you. As long as you promise to teach me how to build things, too. I've always wanted to learn carpentry. Blake's smile was radiant. Really, really. I figure if I'm going to marry a craftsman, I should probably learn the trade. They carried the castle into Harper's apartment together, setting it carefully on her coffee table, where it looked both magnificent and slightly out of place among her modern furniture. But Harper thought that was perfect somehow. The best things in life were often a little out of place, a little unexpected, a little more beautiful than their surroundings. Harper Blake said as they stood back to admire his handiwork. Thank you for what? For seeing who I could be instead of just who I was. For giving me the chance to build something real with you. For teaching me that the best foundations are made of trust instead of information. Harper leaned into his side, feeling the solid warmth of him, breathing in the scent of sawdust and possibilities. Thank you, she said, for showing me that sometimes the most broken things can be rebuilt into something even more beautiful than they were before. Outside, the city hummed with its usual chaos of traffic and sirens and 10 million people living their complicated lives. But inside Harper's small apartment, with a wooden castle on the coffee table and an engagement ring on her finger, and the man she loved standing beside her with sawdust in his hair, everything felt perfect, not the artificial perfection of corporate success or carefully managed public image, but the real, messy, imperfect perfection of two people who'd found each other in the darkness of a broken elevator and decided to build something lasting together. 6 months ago, Harper Williams had been trapped between floors with her worst nightmare.
Ow.
She was about to marry her greatest dream. And the best part was, she knew exactly who he was. Not because she'd read it in a file or learned it through surveillance, but because he'd chosen to show her. Piece by piece, day by day, with the kind of patient honesty that real love required. I love you, she said, the words feeling both new and ancient. Like something she'd been waiting her whole life to say to exactly the right person. I love you too, Blake replied, pulling her closer. More than I ever thought possible. More than I knew I was capable of. And as the sun set over the city, painting Harper's apartment in shades of gold and promise, they stood together planning their future, building their dreams one honest conversation at a time. The end like this video if the story touched your heart. Subscribe for more emotional tales, and share with someone who believes in the power of true love. And let us know in the comments. We love connecting with our global community of romance lovers.